while Foundations for Belonging is not specific to Afghan refugees, it is relevant to their initial experiences as they settle in Australia. It is my hope that the insights gleaned from this research can be harnessed to support the settlement journeys of the many refugees who have begun their settlement into Australia and those who will continue to arrive over the coming months and into the future. Our research reinforces the point that integration of all refugees is a multidimensional reciprocal process, reliant on the active contribution and adaptation of all parties, including refugees, receiving communities and governments at all levels. And for people from refugee backgrounds to build solid foundations in their new home, we must continue to evolve our understanding and support around newcomers' rights, obligations, social connections, and access to services and the labour market. I would like to extend a big thank you to our partners at Western Sydney University, our event partners, ACOS, thank you so very much. The panellists, the wonderful Alison, Larkins, Shabnam, Safa, Shanthi Robinson, and our moderator, Omar, as we listen to this important and I'm sure very interesting conversation on refugee settlement, women and digital inclusion. So it's my pleasure to hand back to our wonderful host, Omar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Violet. I think, as you said, so many of us have been moved to the core in the situation in Afghanistan, and it'll definitely be one of the many things we hope to discuss today. Before we delve into the findings of this year's Foundations for Belonging report, I'd like to introduce you to the members of the panel. Violet mentioned their names, but they are three highly respected women at the forefront of their industries, and their work is really helping shape policy and understanding the key issues surrounding not just refugees, but settlement as well. First is the report co-author, Shanthi Robinson. She's an associate professor at Western Sydney University. Alison Larkins is the Commonwealth Coordinator General for Migrant Services with the Department of Home Affairs. She's actually overseeing the settlement of Afghan arrivals. And Shabnam Safa is the chair of the National Refugee-led Advisory and Advocacy Group, or NRAAG. I'll be speaking with them shortly, but I'd also like to invite you to put any questions you might have for them in the chat function of this Zoom pop-up, and we'll hope to get through some of those later on today. But before that, I'd like to invite Shanthi to present the findings of the 2021 Foundations for Belonging report, along with Ty McMahon, who's the Head of Research and Policy at SSI. He's also one of the co-authors.
Thank you, Omar. Okay, just waiting for the presentation. Thank you, Omar. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on Gadigal country of the people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today in this joint presentation, Shanthi and I will briefly outline this research and some of the findings before we open it up to the panel. We are two of the research authors, and we acknowledge our co-authors, Ingrid, Liam and Emily. There is considerable interest in how refugees fare in terms of settlement integration. Refugees themselves, service providers, policymakers, governments, and the broader Australian community all have a stake in this. These debates about the success of refugee settlement often tend to focus on narrow integration outcomes, such as education or employment. However, the evidence points to settlement integration in fact being a much more multidimensional process, and a two-way process between receiving communities and refugees themselves, and a process that changes over time, with length of residency being particularly critical. For us, the key parts of the puzzle that we wanted to explore with refugees were the social and civic dimensions of settlement, and their everyday sense of welcome, belonging, and participation. To help us do that, we used a framework of integration developed by the UK Home Office with input from refugees, service providers, policymakers, which is on the next slide. So here is that framework. The different levels of settlement integration are on the left column, with 14 domains in rows. In this research, we explored the middle one, the mustard colored one. We explored social connections, which include social bonds, social bridges, and social links. We also explored the foundation level at the bottom around rights, access to rights and fulfillment of responsibilities. And we looked at digital inclusion, which is in blue in the center, which is regarded in this model as a facilitator of integration. Our choices here are not a reflection on the other domains. We know work, housing, and education are important in settlement, but in this research, we wanted to unpack the social and civic domains of integration. We took a number of steps in the design of this research. We used questions from other surveys, which gave us an opportunity to directly compare our findings. We'd conducted the first phase of this research in 2019, so we kept the same focus and added questions on digital inclusion. And this time around, we zeroed in on gender in our data analysis. Secondly, we created a representative sample around gender, ethnicity, visa type, and where refugees lived, whether that was metropolitan or regional. The telephone surveys were conducted by SSI's bilingual guides, which meant that refugees could participate in their preferred first language. And finally, we conducted focus groups with refugee women to help us paint a picture of digital inclusion in their everyday lives. So here's who we spoke to. You can see here the gender breakdown, countries of citizenship, and first languages of survey respondents. About 5% were living in a regional area. This sample is representative of the refugee intake in 2018-2019, as the average length of residency in Australia was 24 months, so 2 years. As with our first phase of this research in 2019, all survey respondents had permanent residency with a mix of different types of humanitarian visas. And with that, I'll hand over to Shanthi, who'll step us through some of the findings.
Hello, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here to launch this report and to go through some of the findings with all of you. I'm Associate Professor Shanthi Robinson, and the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University has just been so thrilled to continue our extremely productive partnership with Settlement Services International to work on these key issues. I'm also calling in from unceded Gadigal land today. So I want to start with our findings on social bonds. In this research, when we talk about social bonds, we're talking about the connections that people have with others from the same cultural background. These are often very supportive relationships with people who share similar values and expectations about life, and they are that very important initial step to establishing connections in a new country. These are the kinds of bonds that are generally, but not always, formed with family and friends who share the same culture, language, and faith and contribute to a sense of belonging. So you can see here from our data that refugees across the board report very high levels of support from within their own communities. With our focus on women in this year's research, we can see here some relatively small but still significant gender differences when it comes to social bonds. Women have a stronger connection to their own community than men, but we also found in the report slightly more negative or neutral perceptions among women of feelings of welcome. Men were only slightly more likely to report mixed friendship networks, but across the board, 2/3 of the refugees we surveyed reported that they had friendship groups made up of people from mixed ethnic and cultural backgrounds. So the second part of our integration framework that we looked at is social bridges. So these are connections with people from other cultural backgrounds. They're really critical to establishing that two-way interaction at the heart of integration that both Violet and Tig have raised. Our findings here really challenge any perceptions that refugees are hesitant to mix with the broader Australian community, or the assumption that English language proficiency is a prerequisite to building strong social bridges. These social bridges can, in fact, exist, even when people are still developing their English language capacity. And here we have some of our data on social links. So social links refers to that next level of engagement with institutions, government and non-government services in particular. So we looked here at the ability for these newly arrived refugees to engage with and benefit from essential and other government services, and alongside this, to develop a sense of independence and a sense of trust in the institutions of society. What we see here in our findings this year very much validate the findings from the previous report that we published in 2020 in terms of social links, a lot of consistency there between the two projects and the two rounds of survey data. We would say that thanks in a large part to the humanitarian settlement program, even at this relatively early stage of settlement, the refugees we studied report an awareness of knowing where to find somewhere to live, to find a school or childcare, to get around and navigate transport, to use government and commercial services, and to access emergency support if needed. We did see weaker confidence in knowing how to find a job and knowing about their rights, but in both of these measures, refugees in this sample were more knowledgeable compared to other refugees in Australia. For this year's research, we added an additional question on accessing services through apps and the internet. And we feel this is really significant due to the intensification of the digitalisation of services over the last few years, including in the last 2 years due to COVID. It's quite notable that close to 40% of the refugees we surveyed said that they would know only a little or wouldn't know how to get help through online and app-based services. In terms of the most common difficulties reported, we can see here that accessing government services, the difficulties identified were language and long waiting times for an appointment. This 2020 cohort really confirmed the findings of the previous research that online or internet difficulties were a very common barrier to accessing government services. And as far as we're aware, this hasn't really been previously assessed in longitudinal research among refugees in Australia. So it's certainly something to keep an eye on in future research. Also of note here, women do report weaker knowledge than men in virtually all aspects of social links. In our focus groups with refugee women, we did see a suggestion of a link between social bonds and social links. So women often relied on support from family members or close community networks to actually assist them with that access and understanding of services. Okay, so moving on to our digital inclusion data, which is one of the most exciting parts of the report, I think. So we are comparing here to a survey of the mainstream population that is a little bit old now, the Household Use of Information Technology survey. But even if we take that into account, refugees by and large are faring quite well on baseline measures of digital access. Our study found that 95% of newly arrived refugee households have access to the internet at home. 88% reported having a sufficient data allowance, and they use the internet at similar rates to the rest of the Australian community, with no noticeable differences there by age, gender, household composition, or country of birth. Refugee households reported higher than average numbers of mobile phones or smartphones, and this aligns very much with global research, which continues to show the importance of mobile phones for refugees in seeking information and staying in touch with loved ones. However, one key thing to note here, the refugee households in our survey were less likely than other Australian households to have laptops, desktops, and tablets. So this is a bit of a concerning finding, particularly because households with children under 15 had fewer laptops or desktops, which are often necessary for school education, than households without children under 15. And this is also the opposite of trends in other Australian households in mainstream surveys. So compared to that general household use of information technology survey, respondents in our survey use the internet in different ways and far less in some areas. So this refugee sample were nearly on par with the mainstream population in relation to social media use, but they use the internet less for things like purchasing goods and services, health services, or banking. Social media, entertainment, and accessing services like welfare were the top uses for refugees in our study. Our research also shows this small but quite persistent gender gap in terms of digital inclusion, with women reporting less internet use than men across all of the online activities we asked about, as well as reporting that they were significantly more likely to struggle with navigating online settlement support and essential services. Younger women and women with children under 18 in their household reported fewer difficulties. And this was sort of backed up by some evidence in our focus groups that younger refugee women can act as digital enablers in their community by assisting older relatives or members of the household to learn digital skills. Okay, we've got some very broad and very high level implications here on the slide. There are plenty more policy implications and much more detail in the report, which is now available on the SSI website. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present. And I'd just like to really join Tig as I finish in thanking the other members of our research team, Ingrid Koulos, Liam McGee, and Emily Bagans, for all their work in putting this report together. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Shanthi and Tig, and as you mentioned, the rest of your team behind that research. It really provides us the springboard into our discussion today. And just a reminder, if you do want to lob a question to the panel, just to chop it in, drop it into the chat function. Shabnam, I want to open today's discussion with you. You came to Australia as a refugee from Afghanistan when you were 14. And now you advocate for greater inclusion for refugees. Going through this report, were there particular issues raised that resonated with you?
Absolutely, Omar. And I would also like to begin by acknowledging that I am dialing in from the Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation today, and thank Uncle Alan Madden for that wonderful welcome. I feel very honoured. And can I also acknowledge, as an Afghan Australian woman joining today, the incredible community compassion, as Violet spoke to earlier as well, has been that outpouring of support and compassion and generosity in the last few weeks in response to the horrific crisis in Afghanistan has been a very uplifting, and has provided the Afghan community with much needed support right now to keep going. It's an incredibly difficult time for all of us across the board. COVID has not been easy for anyone. So such big numbers of people joining us today on this call just goes to show the values that the Australian community really want to put out there and demonstrate that, you know, we are a country of welcome. I was very pleased to see in the report that active shift towards more strengths-based perspectives on refugee resettlement and integration. We talk about it, we've started talking about it a lot, which is a really good and positive step. So often refugees are seen as people who need to be taught the right thing to do to achieve better settlement outcomes and effective integration. I'm going to try and not use the term successful integration a lot, because I feel like that's a very personal and it's a personal assessment to make. You know, a successful is measured by the person who feels like their integration has been a success so far. But acknowledging and utilizing the vast skills and experiences that refugees already have to make that journey more efficient. That was really nice to see in the report, and that, you know, that there's this overwhelming drive within the refugee community to become self-sufficient. And I can speak to my own family's experience to that. I came here when I was a teenager with my 3 younger brothers and my mum and dad. And while all of us have spent the same amount of time in Australia, each one of us have been on a very, very different settlement journey. But at the core of that has been that high desire to become as independent and as self-sufficient as soon as possible, so we can start giving back to the community. And, you know, refugees in general do have very strong ties with their homelands, but they also want to make the new homes and become positive and productive members of the community here as soon as possible. And we've seen that, you know, refugees in general are very entrepreneurial. They're not just creating opportunities for themselves, they're creating a lot of opportunities to others as well, and contributing to that economic, cultural and social landscape of Australia. It's changing partly because of those contributions. Having said that, the effective integration, as mentioned as well, it is a really whole of society responsibility. And COVID, the pandemic has demonstrated that, you know, we as a sector, or, you know, as a community, as a country, are capable of adapting and tailoring our approaches, and can make drastic changes to enable better outcomes, and I hope that we can continue doing that. The report mentioned the fact that, you know, refugee households do use are more connected digitally across social media, but I think we should also not forget that language plays a huge part in that. Whilst, you know, a lot of that use of that digital platforms are within the communities themselves, where English language isn't playing a big role. Language barriers still heavily hinder progress in integration, and it is not just the inability to communicate in English, it's a bridge to the social fabric of the society. The more people can't communicate in the language of the country that they're in, the more they're left behind in the society, the more they become isolated. So, and that's especially important now that most services and programs are becoming digital. And as we're shifting in that direction, that we're not making this journey double as difficult, or twice as difficult. Double as difficult. English is not my first language. Twice as difficult for refugees. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion and see, you know, where the implications of this research goes.
Shabnam, you're far too humble. That was very well put. I want to unpick this digital divide of sorts shortly, but I suppose one of the striking elements that came from this report was this I guess further evidence of women facing greater barriers than men. They have significantly less trust in the wider community, less likely to feel welcomed. Shanthi, when you came across these findings, what did you make of that?
Well, I mean, I would note that the gender gap is there. It's not an enormous gender gap on a lot of those indicators. So, for example, you know, the mixed friendship networks, women are only reporting that at slightly less levels than men, and the majority of refugees in the sample are feeling like they've got connections there. But I think a lot of that does circulate, particularly around age and life stage. So if we look at the demographics in the data, it's quite clear that the people who are probably struggling the most to build some of those social links and social bridges are often older women, and particularly women that don't have children in the household. And I think that's really quite a finding that's not too surprising in a way, because for people with school-age children, a lot of connection with community, a lot of capacities to build friendships come through having young kids in school and being engaged in parenting. And I mean, that happens across all of the community, not just in the refugee community. And we do know that older age and single people living alone, again, there's across the board acknowledgement in all of our social statistics and work that lots of people do, that a lack of connection and loneliness and needing more opportunities to really connect with community can often be connected to age and life stage there. So all of those things are critical. The younger women that we surveyed experienced much more fluid and easier access, both in terms of digital inclusion, but also in terms of more broadly on those social links and social bridges. And I would sort of highlight there, you know, I think what's really important when we look at this research around refugee communities is to actually think beyond the individual when we think about integration, because what really comes through in our research is the relationships really, really matter. This kind of whole of community and whole of household effects in how people build bridges and links are really, really critical. So younger people are playing a key role in their communities and families to enable connections, the families playing a key role, the communities playing a key role. So I think to sort of follow on from Shabnam's point, I think one thing we would highlight here is looking at the ecology and the ecosystem and the relationality of processes of welcome and belonging, rather than kind of indicators at the level of the individual.
Alison, Larkins, when we look at as the research in the presentation suggested, and as Shanthi has mentioned, there's in certain age brackets for women, the findings were that there were some inadequacies in terms of policy or practice. What do you make of that suggestion? And if there are gaps, how, from a Commonwealth to a trickle down, how do you bridge those gaps?
Thank you, Omar. And can I just acknowledge that I'm speaking to people from the beautiful Ngunnawal lands of the Ngunnawal people in Canberra today. So I think we do, and also just to say, it was so fantastic to read this report. It's such a positive picture of both the efforts of refugees and the efforts of the communities in which they are settling to build good community and good connections. And I just found it a very positive picture of how well the whole community is doing in helping people to settle. So thank you, and thank you so much. I think it's a really great piece of work. In terms of women, I do think that we see women arriving in Australia, that there is a gap in educational outcomes in language capacity when people come to Australia. And so part of the challenge, I think, is to ensure that we are designing services in a way that helps women go as fast as they want to in their settlement journey. We've certainly seen in the AMEP, the Adult Migrant English Program, that there's been quite a lot of criticism about how accessible that program is to women, particularly women with who also have caring responsibilities. And I think the common story will be that people come, they focus on the needs of their children, and in the old settings under the Adult Migrant English Program, by the time they got around to having time to focus on themselves, they were no longer eligible for the program. What we are doing in terms of language learning is a couple of things that are really focused on making English language learning more accessible to women. And one is we've removed a lot of the barriers about when people can start and how long, and time limits, which mean women who want to focus on getting other people in their family settled well can then come back to the program at a time that works for them. And the other thing is we're wanting to have a much more flexible program that really responds in the way that particular women want to learn, more use of digital products to support language learning. And certainly there are a few examples of people using digital tools to support their language learning in the report. And interestingly, at the moment in the AMEP, 71% of those people who are enrolled are women. And of the people coming back into the program since we've lifted the restrictions, we've got a greater proportion of women. So we just want to increase the way that our programs respond to the needs of women and support them to meet them in a way that meets their specific needs.
Shabnam, what do you make of that? And I suppose when it comes to more targeted messaging, as the report recommended, and that from community to community, that would have a profoundly different or even subtle difference in how it's done. How do you see that, I suppose, not just being bridged little by little, but how do you see it being effectively reaching the communities that still are falling behind in terms of whether it's digital inclusion or social inclusion? And as the report found, they're both inextricably linked together.
I think it goes back to the point Shanthi raised earlier as well, on taking that whole of family approach and not just focusing on an individual and their integration or settlement outcomes. I would say that the families with younger children at home have a slightly more positive experience, because the responsibility heavily still lies on the shoulders of the children who are, who are learning the English language faster, who are navigating the systems faster. and I would like to advocate for more support for them as well, because they're not just carrying their own weight forward, they're carrying the responsibility of their entire family. I often joke that, I was an unpaid interpreter for 10 years of my life, starting from a very young age, and did not get paid for my services. But as I mentioned earlier, if that doesn't happen, then I would see people like my parents more and more removed from the society, and reclusing to those cultural bubbles, and then it's harder to break through those bubbles once they're formed and once they're solid, once people start becoming comfortable. I'm not saying let's go and break cultural communities, but there is, especially right now, there is a huge momentum across the country, and I'd say across the many nations like Australia to do something more. And I feel like it's really an opportunity for us to look at, to reflect and see and assess how much we are able to be flexible in our programs, and look at how much we can deviate a little bit from the traditional frameworks of what settlement looks like and what programs should be put in place. It was really nice to hear Alison talk about the fact that we do acknowledge that by the time women have figured out the priorities for their children and the rest of their family, it's too late for them, and they miss out on those opportunities. So being more flexible and adaptable in our approaches and the services that we provide it's a crucial step to begin with.
I'm going to go to one of our first panelists, question from the audience. This is for Shanthi. Someone wants to ask, did you investigate with the research how confident the communities that were interviewed were in accessing those services online, or staying safe online, rather than access to it just purely? Are they feeling more confident in the use of it?
No, we didn't have specific measures around confidence specifically in this survey. That's probably definitely something that we would be wanting to delve into with future research. So we looked at access, and we looked at what kinds of practices people mostly did online and compared that to a more general population. The one indicator that we really do have is in terms of access to services, online and internet difficulties were identified in the survey, along with language, as a key access barrier. So that does really indicate that there are some issues there around people feeling confident in accessing online services. And I think with the digitization of service delivery, that's a really key thing that can be focused on, is thinking about, okay, how do we build inclusion and how do we give people the capacities to be able to access services online? And I think that's absolutely something that needs to be really carefully considered. What was the second part of that question, Omar?
It was more, did you investigate how confident communities interviewed were in accessing services online or staying safe online?
Yeah, safety is a really interesting one. Also something that we didn't necessarily measure in this survey. It did come out quite a lot in focus groups though. Again, I think, like many of us, people are increasingly concerned in the refugee community about safety and security. And there's some other research I've been doing as well, which indicates people are really thinking about what they share online, what their kids are doing online. And there often are cultural and linguistic barriers to people really gaining understanding around privacy and consent. And particularly when it comes to access and assistance, it was raised in our focus groups that, yes, we're all happy to help each other as a community accessing these services, but the way privacy works around things like online banking is you shouldn't really be sharing your passwords or sharing your information with people. And so that very individualized kind of notion of online privacy sometimes can make it a little bit hard for people to actually work together. So that's another thing to kind of think about. Again, issues around privacy and service delivery, they're whole of community issues as well. And it's a matter of thinking through, how do we discuss these issues, discuss the ethics of online privacy, discuss the ethics and inclusion and accessibility issues around digitization. And when we have those discussions, how do we make sure that the perceptions and the views of our refugee communities are adequately included in those discussions. I think one of the issues that I find in a broad sense with technology is there tends to be very solutionist thinking around technology, and there also tends to be thinking that thinks about users of technology as if we're all the same, as if we're all homogenous, thinking that things like gender and culture and language and life experience don't have any bearing on your experience as a user of technology. And of course they all do. So I think that's something we can all sort of work together on, not thinking about tech users as all one kind of homogenous experience, and thinking about how things like culture, things like migrant or refugee background really do come to bear on how we engage with technology and what some of our fears and anxieties around it might be too.
It's so interesting. This is probably not a particularly profound point from my end, because we've seen it over decades, just how technology keeps improving and increasing. And when I was a kid, desktops were only starting to become a thing, and we came from we were economic migrants, so there was so for us it was the barriers there were barriers, but not in the ways for, say, other families, particularly on the language front. But now that as our society moves, we're moving more towards technology, and not only are we shifting with that, now we're seeing with COVID, we're so reliant on it, and that the research, Shanthi, kind of raised this COVID conundrum a little bit. So we've seen COVID shut down communities and restrict some opportunities for face-to-face social integration. But then on the other hand, according to the research, it's led to an accelerated change in people's lives, having to improve their abilities in using their technologies to access those essential services. I'm going to direct this question to you, Alison. I suppose from the advisory panels, from the work that you do, how have you seen in the last year and a half those changes really change for the better, and what kind of improvements have you learned through this time that needs to be made to, I suppose, make messaging more targeted or to enable better access for communities?
Sorry, I just needed to unmute. So I think what on the really positive side, I think we've had a lot of our service providers, so people providing adult migrant English classes, but also our settlement providers, really have to work through how do you provide support to people, settlement support, when you are basically locked down and people are locked down, and just really creative thinking about how to deliver that support and continual innovation. And what is really interesting is now we've got the evacuees from Afghanistan in Australia. All that was learnt over the last 18 months about how to keep connected with people when you're not seeing them face to face, and how to do case management and make people feel welcome when you can't actually be there at the airport to say welcome home. I think all of that has put us in really fantastic place to be able to provide services at the moment when we're under a lot of pressure to do so. I think the thing that we're still working on is really just getting, so this is like a personal observation, just getting better at thinking through our communication strategies. And that's not just thinking about the most appropriate channels and being thoughtful about who we're communicating to and how they prefer to be communicated to. And I found this report really very instructive around that, just looking at the extent of social media use and just thinking how well are we using the channels that people are actually attending to use themselves. So I think there's a channel conversation, and have we got that right? And clearly we saw some fantastic things done in COVID, and the work that SBS did in getting messages to people in language was really fantastic.
I'll stop it, Alison.
But I also think a reflection would be we've got more to learn about how to communicate simply and clearly, how to think about the cultural bias in the way that we certain concepts that we might think make sense and translate across all of the cultures that live in our communities that clearly don't. So I do think there's a lot more learning on the part of government to really think, how do we communicate in a simple way in English? And then how does that simple message and clear concepts in English, how are they translated and then how are they communicated? I don't think we're there yet. I think COVID has been a really fantastic learning opportunity for all of us around it.
Shabnam, Safa, your reflections there.
Yeah, just on that point, I would also like to acknowledge that we can tap on a huge resource available through community representatives and leaders themselves. There is a huge desire and motivation to want to help our communities get there faster. And we've seen that happen in significant ways during the COVID pandemic across the different states, each going through on a different timeline, but every state has had a moment where they've had to rely on community leaders to bring their communities together. And, it does go to the point where of the social bonds or those smaller circles that the services can't get through given the infrastructure, the mechanisms that it operates on, but the community leaders and representatives can get through those, and that can be an opportunity to have more open communications. But we need to be flexible around that. We need to look beyond just hiring one or two people from a community in a community engagement team. We need to look at how our services and programs are designed from multiple angles, or how much of community perspectives are included in the design phase of a program, not just in the delivery phase. Because it makes a huge difference when that agency is given to community members as well.
And as you mentioned, Alison, we are now seeing, well, I suppose we're implementing the strategies or what we've learned over the last 18 months with the arrivals from Afghanistan. We've had our borders shut for refugee resettlement during COVID, but now we're now seeing people arrive. In terms of, you mentioned not being able to work face-to-face in some instances, but now just shifting gears to the fallout of what's happened over the last few months in Afghanistan. For those arriving here, your work, you're co-chairing an advisory panel of 12. I believe half of the 12 members are from Australia's Afghan groups, and I believe 2 are from the Hazara community. Collectively, what are you all seeing as the urgent and immediate points of focus for the 3,000 Afghan refugees who are set to arrive and are arriving? And how are you bridging those gaps due to COVID, I suppose? Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry, I feel like that's one thing that I've learned not at all in the last 18 months. I don't seem to have got any better at that. A few things. Part of the cohort have come in on temporary visas, and that was done pragmatically as a way to help in what was an incredibly fast-moving evacuation process that all of you will know. So, of course, our first priority is to clarify what are the pathways to permanent residence for those people. And just going back to the report, I think everyone recognises that at the foundation of driving good settlement and integration outcomes, or people being able to drive them for themselves, that certainty of permanent residency is really critical. And certainly the government's intention is for people to be offered a pathway to permanent residency. So we've been working through that. We've been working through ensuring people have access to the essential services that they need. So Medicare, income support, so the social safety net. We've been working very closely with our service providers, of which SSI is one, on supporting them to stand up their service delivery. And I have to say, it's been really extraordinary to watch a group of services who've really had to wind down because of COVID, come back up so quickly, find bicultural workers, be in a position to deliver services to people who are in quarantine. It's across the country, it's been an incredibly inspiring thing to watch. Of course, we are looking at access to appropriate mental health services, including torture and trauma. And the panel are meeting again tomorrow, and we'll start to get down to the next level of detail around things such as health service access and how that's going, and the handover from the quarantine health service into the community. We're also thinking about employment for this cohort. We know we've got in this cohort a number of people, a proportion of this cohort will have good language skills and be very keen to move quickly in terms of employment. So we're thinking through how we might support that more. And importantly, I think a number of people have mentioned the really significant outpouring of interest and desire to help in the settlement of this cohort of people. So we are working through with the panel, how do we best both support Afghan community organisations to support the new arrivals and to be a source of stability and strength at a time when the community is under significant challenge, but also how do we best link in other Australians who want to support in this effort? How do we direct that effort in a way that is helpful and builds good social connection across with people coming into the country? I'll stop there, Omar.
Oh, sorry. That's all right. Thank you. Shabnam, you're also seeing that work firsthand. As you've mentioned, your phone's going off the hook, you're receiving calls and emails from communities. What are you seeing? Are you also seeing that need for temporary visas to be rapidly processed a bit more? What are you hearing from people that are reaching out to you?
Thanks, Omar. For starters, I'm hoping that the number doesn't stay on 3,000. There has been commitment from the government that that's a floor, not a ceiling, and the overwhelming perspectives from the community and desire at the moment is to see that number increase significantly and as fast as is practical, really. As you said, I don't know a single Afghan in my contacts right now in Australia who hasn't been inundated and completely overwhelmed over the last few weeks. The trauma and the grief of what is happening in Afghanistan aside, there's just been a significant demand from the community as they see to provide a lifeline for those who are at risk. And it is important that we do acknowledge those who are within our community as well. There are around 5,000 Afghan refugees from Afghanistan right now who do not have permanent protection in Australia, whilst international actions or operations right now might be quite difficult. There is an opportunity for us to do something for people of Afghanistan right now on our own shores. And as it has been mentioned, that secure and clarity of future and security around permanent residency makes a huge difference. And a lot of these people haven't felt like they belong in Australia because that hasn't happened yet. This is also an opportunity to harness that community support, that outpouring of and motivation from a diverse cohort of Australian community. I don't think in the 12 years that I have been involved and have been in Australia, I haven't seen such a different, the different sectors of Australian community coming together, like, you know, the churches, the business sector, the veterans community, and there needs to be a vehicle provided to drive and guide that energy right now while we still have the opportunity. I think this is the moment to take really bold steps and harness that support. And it's because the community overall understands that these are very challenging times and the government doesn't have to do this alone.
Shanthi, Shabnam touched on this, the feeling of permanent residency, and it's also touched in the report that there's a really stronger feeling or that sense of belonging for those who know that their lives here isn't going to be changed at any given moment in time, that there's more of a permanency rather than a temporary status. What are your reflections on that? And I believe the respondents in your research were all permanent residents, is that right?
That's absolutely right. And that's a really important key message of the research as well. I think, as was pointed out earlier, there's lots of good news messages in the data that we've collected. But, you know, I really want to be very strong on the fact that all of the refugees in this sample had permanent residency in Australia. And that really, this research shows how clearly that permanent residency, that right to permanently reside, is just the bedrock for all of these other indicators of welcome and belonging. So that sense of security is just so critical and so foundational to every other indicator that we can think of social connection, of settlement. And I think the other really core thing there too, which is critical at that policy level, is access to family reunion as well. You know, that is another thing that really drives a sense of welcome, belonging, trust, security, and ever more critical when we're seeing situations like we're seeing in Afghanistan. So yeah, absolutely, I would say that's a very, very core message of the research. I think, number one, how critical permanent residency is to people being able to become feel that sense of welcome and also to be able to become full members of society. But second, I think how much incredible work a really well-structured settlement program does as well, and how much those early stages, you know, those first 2 years of settlement services, how that also really provides the bedrock for people's sense of welcome and belonging, which they then carry through to the rest of their lives. So those are both very critical dimensions.
Unfortunately, the situation in Afghanistan and the ensuing humanitarian crisis is only the latest that we're seeing, and there are so many other conflicts that are still dragging on, and humanitarian and refugee crises that evolve from that. We also saw in the fallout of the Syrian civil war a special intake visa during that time in 2016. Now, Alison, with these issues, inevitably the debate begins about whether Australia is taking too many, if it's taking too little. And I suppose I want to ask you about this panel that you've also been part of, where you conducted a review into the community support program, which is based on a model from Canada, where individuals, businesses, or community groups covered the resettlement costs of refugees. Immigration Minister Alex Hawke's publicly stated that he's a supporter of the program. Could you just firstly, on the point of the 3,000 number with Afghanistan, do you take that there's possibility for that number to increase? Is there capacity according to the Commonwealth that's possible? Can that number increase? And Omar, No, go on.
Well, just on that, I think both the Minister Hawke and the Prime Minister have stated publicly that they consider the 3,000 to be a floor, not a ceiling, and I think the expectation is that that number will grow. So I think there'll be more announcements on that, but my expectation is it will be more than 3,000.
And just on that Canadian model, could you briefly talk us through those findings that you made, and what struck you most about the modelling in terms of efficiency, viability? That for me, it seems to suggest that if it's a viable efficient process, that Australia's refugee intake would potentially be able to grow to a point that's sustainable beyond just the Commonwealth level, that communities can bankroll support those arriving.
I think there are two critical benefits of the community sponsorship approach. And I think sometimes we focus on one of those, which is it's a way of having a debate with the government about the size of the program. So you can say, well, if we meet these costs, then you should expand the size of the program. And I totally understand that argument. And I think there's widespread support for that argument for the places being additional in Australia. So, and I know that that those views are widely understood. But I guess the other benefit is that this approach, a community sponsorship approach, which really takes a small group of community members and puts them in the role of critical supporters to people in their settlement journey, that what we can see in Canada is though people coming in through that pathway tend to have better employment outcomes, better language outcomes, better sense of belonging. And I guess the supposition is partly that's because the social connections are built into the program earlier. So that it has an inbuilt strength of creating immediate community for people coming in through that pathway. So I do know Minister Hawke is, I have given him the review, he's looking at it. I think he said publicly he's looking very favourably at the scheme. He's a big fan of what is happening in Canada. So I expect there'll be announcements on that in the near future.
Shabnam, are you a fan of this model as well?
I absolutely am, Omar. I do wear another hat. I do work at Community Refugee Sponsorship Australia as well, that is trying to work with the different stakeholders and to improve that model. And you know, we heard last night at a event that 9 million Canadians were involved or knew someone who was involved in sponsoring refugees to Canada after the Syrian conflict. And I think that just demonstrates that, you know, there is, as Alison mentioned as well, there is significant positive outcomes for people. It provides that window to engage and connect with the wider social support network from the first day that you come in. Right now, we do have that opportunity in Australia, and the crisis in Afghanistan has as sad as it is, that crisis has provided this opportunity for us to embrace that allyship. I noticed a question from in the Q&A that asks, what can established migrant communities do? And I think right now that is a significant way established communities can help, because this isn't an immediate response needed. You know, right? Yes, we need to evacuate people in an emergency situation, but once people do arrive, and we know this because we're all in working in the settlement space, that successful settlement and effective integration takes months and years. And, you know, some would argue that it doesn't end. It would take generations for people to feel like they've successfully integrated, and that takes a whole of community. And that's a whole of community responsibility to come together and provide that environment.
I really found your point about earlier that you said about it's not up to you to say successful integration. It's a sense of self feeling that can take so long, or can come and go in terms of an emotion. And I really find that quite a poignant point. You took the words out of my mouth. I was about to lob you with that question about how established communities from migrant backgrounds can do more. And we credit Paul Mortimer from the Irish National Association for that. And if you have any more questions, just lob them in the Q&A function in Zoom. I suppose whenever we discuss refugee resettlement intake numbers, no matter what, just similar with COVID, so many issues in the world, really, that this is something that inevitably falls into being politicized, or it falling within a certain political ideology rather than it being just a social discussion. I suppose, Shanthi, how do you make genuine sustained progress? Because your work is to really analyze from refugees, migrants. So as a sociologist, how do you cut through that political discourse and just have a genuine conversation about this?
It's a difficult question, right, in the current political environment. I think particularly because we're just dealing with a lot of information overload at the moment as a society, and it can be quite hard to get that cut through. I think I would probably approach that question by going back really to what Paul has raised in the chat, to say, well, what do we do as community members, as members of Australian society? What can we do to support? And I think Shabnam's highlighted a lot that's going on at the moment with activism and advocacy. There's a range of really excellent resources on SSI's website at the moment about how people in the Australian community can support the Afghan community during this time. And obviously there's voting with your feet as well, and supporting the political parties that are looking to support the permanent protection of refugees. But I think, to go to Paul's point and to kind of turn it back a little bit to what we really found in the research, and that's that the little everyday things really do matter. And they matter not just to refugees feeling a sense of welcome, but they also matter to the wider community having a better understanding of what the refugee experience actually is, and building that sense of empathy and connection. So at that level of, your everyday individual person that thinks, well, what should I be doing? Our research really abundantly finds small everyday interactions of friendliness, of neighborliness are so critical. Saying hello over the fence, the waving, the smiling. People talked about that in focus groups. My mum doesn't speak English at all, but when she walks down the street in the morning, the neighbors say hello, they wave, we bring them food, the kids play together. I'd also say another critical finding in our research is the level of the local social and civic organisation. And obviously all of this stuff is very limited during a lockdown. But if you are active in your local sports club, if you run a mother's group, if you run a book club, if you run a community garden, if you're involved in any of these like local everyday neighbourhood groups, I think it's so important to have a think about how those spaces can become more inclusive, how those spaces can reach out and bring people into the fold. Because certainly what we're finding is, again, those local level connections just are the basis that start building that broader sense of belonging. And absolutely, to your point, Omar, that reciprocity, because the more people are working together in these small local groups, the more we develop that kind of sense that we are all in this together and we are one community. And I think so many positive things really build from there. I think we're seeing that even more during COVID too, actually. And I think the same things probably hold for virtual spaces in which we're building community and socializing and trying to stay in touch with each other too. Those spaces also can think about the work they need to do to be inclusive, to bring people in, to promote that kind of mutual sense of understanding.
Out of hope, I'm not generalizing, Shabnam, breaking through the social connection in terms of whether it's a gardening group or a reading group or a running group, when we can run with others again. There's that initial hesitancy to go in or to strike a connection, that fear of being vulnerable. I believe it's touched on in the report, particularly for women. Does that also ring true for you, Shabnam? And as Shanthi mentioned, there's that reciprocity. It's two-way situation. But how do you help the other side make that first step?
It is the hesitance is real, and if not addressed, it can last for many years, and do lead to isolation of communities at times. When I was younger, when I had just come to Australia, I used to not really understand why people said that Australia politically has an anti-refugee narrative, and there's just a lot of political opposition to refugees coming into this country. And I didn't understand that, because everyone I met in my community, everyone I had contacts with, absolutely welcomed me and my family, and the support that we received from those local neighborhood groups, those our neighbors, or somebody who was a member of a church who used to bring us bread on Sundays and spend another 5 hours at home with us, watching TV and just talking to us, and just providing that sense of welcome and acceptance. That was my experience of having come across anyone. So I really didn't understand why people would say that Australia has an anti-refugee narrative, because that's not what I experienced, until obviously I became older and understood that it is a bit of a political, it has become a bit of a political football. And as Shanthi said, we do vote with our feet. We can stop this from becoming more politicized. But and that can also happen through those smaller day-to-day connections. If we can provide more opportunities for more people to meet people like me and go, oh, okay, she's not that bad, or they do have very similar stories to us. You would find that a lot of people have very similar values and have the same problems in their life, or have the same aspirations for their future. That breaks down those hesitancies and creates a bigger, if the more people in Australia meet refugees and just aren't afraid of them, the better the acceptance and the welcome, and that whole collective story will be.
Alison, just finally on the debate regarding settlement and refugees. You work in the factory. You're in Canberra. You see from a federal level how policy is shaped, but you also have to deal with the debates that fall out of policy, and that can fall into ideological debates, or and particularly with this issue, there can be levels of vitriol on many sides. How do you navigate that through your work in terms of focusing on what your work with communities and with federal state leaders has led you to find?
So I think in my role, I'm sort of focused on telling the positive stories, and not just telling the positive refugee stories, which we have so many fantastic stories about the settlement journey of refugees and how they've contributed to our country. Like, we have enormous numbers. But also trying to find those stories which go to how the broader community is responding. Within my role, I'm trying to give a more realistic picture of what settlement looks like in communities. And I think we can see just extraordinary examples all the way across Australia, from Western Sydney, where we've got incredible diversity in the communities that people are settling into, to Armidale, where we've got much less diversity. And there are really positive stories about how the existing community is supporting newcomers to feel at home and to feel like they belong. And so part of the way I navigate is by trying to focus on telling more about that story. And I think the more Australians, and I think you've seen it in the last couple of weeks, the outpouring of generosity, and not just warm feeling, people really doing practical things that are helpful, sourcing clothes for people who come off planes with only one the clothes that they were wearing. So there are really positive stories, and I think at the heart of the country there's a real sense of welcome, and I actually that shows through in the research too. I think people quickly feel like they belong. There's good connections. We need to focus on that. We need to tell those stories more.
I want to ask in a moment about the social media kind of infringing in some respects, but the feeling of belonging in terms of that vitriol that falls through from there. But I just wanted to stick a pin in that for a moment. I want to go to an audience question, and Alison, this one's for you. During COVID, we obviously had refugee resettlement paused, the intake paused, and during this time we have refugees now overseas set to come to Australia with their visas processed but unable to arrive. So the question is, the refugees who are now stuck overseas will have different mental health needs when they join us next year. What is the best strategy to ensure that we are prepared to support them?
Can I just say before I start that we have actually had people coming in. We haven't had anywhere near the numbers, but we have continued to play a role internationally in bringing people across the border who were in dire circumstances. So we've taken a number of emergency cases, and I don't have that number in my head, but it's hundreds of people, not tens. So it hasn't been a completely closed border in terms of refugee entrance.
But considerably reduced to be.
Without question. But we still have contributed to take in emergency cases. I think we've got very positive and strong and well-connected torture and trauma services, and we've got a good network of torture and trauma services around Australia, and we've also got good referral pathways from both our settlement services into those torture and trauma services, and from our state and Commonwealth funded primary health care into those services. I think in Australia generally we're recognising the need to, and I think COVID's illustrated this, but I think we've had the Royal Commission in Victoria, and we are generally in a process of improving our mental health services. And I think, like all other services, there is a particular need to ensure that, given the diversity of our community, we are building mainstream services that work for everyone who's coming in. So there are specific services to respond to people with torture and trauma concerns. There's more to do about continuing to ensure our mainstream services respond effectively to people that come from a refugee background.
Shabnam, when it comes to responding to the darker side of our use of technology and digital inclusion being a betterment for social integration, how do you see the vitriol that we all see on social media, particularly when it comes to this issue, and that can obviously have an impact on mental health for people that have escaped this incomprehensible trauma and now trying to make a new life for themselves here? This is, it's becoming an age-old question, but how, from a grassroots level, do you try and navigate that?
I think there are a couple of different parts to that question. That's a very loaded question, Omar.
Well, I apologize. I don't mean to be loaded.
I think with the new arrivals and those coming in the future who have been evacuated from Afghanistan, I think it is important for us to acknowledge that their mental health needs and concerns would be quite different, and they will need some tailored approaches towards that. Not discrediting the mental health needs and concerns of refugees and migrant communities, but these are people who have become refugees within 2 weeks. Their lives have been uprooted in front of their eyes, and I feel like they still haven't grasped, or they would still would need to process that. I would like to see our multicultural health, mental health providers address that in a more tailored, from a more tailored lens. In response to how do we combat the negativity in social media, I just don't know if that's possible. I resign myself to the fact that a lot of this is existing in social media, and people overwhelmingly in their day-to-day lives don't hold that negative or such wicked views. It's a lot easier to be a keyboard warrior than it is to hold or say things like that in someone's face. But having said that, obviously that does have impact, broader political impacts for our community. And, you know, it's a burdensome work for those, for refugee communities themselves, for migrant communities, but also everyone else who works to support these communities to keep up their work, but also counteract these negative stories. And I also feel conflicted by suggesting that we need to promote more positive stories, because then we create this narrative of a shiny refugee or a grateful refugee who's done all these great works and who are very resilient and who will be forever grateful, because not everyone's experience is like that. But the more positive interactions and opportunities of dialogue we can create within our society, I feel like that would somehow manage some of those negative outcomes. And we need to create that at a grassroots level. Showing some media positive examples is one thing, but how are people engaging with those different from them in whatever way on a day-to-day level, whether that's, you know, in their neighborhood groups, or that's in their workplaces, or you know, at the local milk shop, or in any all of their day-to-day interactions. How are those opinions changing?
I suppose it's about, as you mentioned, just having an honest but respectful conversation, not only about the pitfalls that can come up, but also how to accurately and honestly address every person's story and have them have that opportunity to tell their story. Just personally, that's how I found in my line of work. I'm going to move to a final audience question before some final reflections. And Shanthi, this is for you. We've touched on this, but the research shows a gender gap. What does the research tell us about the top gender gaps from your findings?
Okay, so I think as Tig and I presented, probably based on what we've discussed today, the biggest gap there would be around digital practices and digital use. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to scroll through my slides now to make sure I say the correct thing. So there weren't really significant gender differences in the reasons why refugees use the internet, but women were less likely to nominate on a lot of the different reasons we asked them about. So women were just less active on some of these kind of measures, you know, for example, banking, purchasing goods and services, accessing welfare and social services. But what's a kind of interesting thing to point out there is women actually had much higher interaction when it came to using the internet for online communication. So maintaining those links with family and friends, not just locally, but also transnationally. So it's a bit of a mixed picture really there with the gender gap actually. And in terms of social bonds and social links, again, we see women actually much stronger on their links within community and a little bit less stronger than men in some of those links outside of the community. So I think the message really there is for gender is leveraging those social bonds at the community level, empowering those existing really strong links that women have within their own communities and making sure that that can then radiate out. I mean, we have really focused on women in this report. I will say, though, that the gender differences that we found are not huge. There is a small, I think the key message is there's a small gender gap there on some of these issues of social links and digital inclusions, and it's a bit persistent across a few of the different indicators, but it is a relatively small gap. And I think that's also a good news story because that means it's a gap that we can close with a bit of specific attention to women's needs in the way we think about policy and community building.
Alison, Larkins, your final reflections of today's discussion.
Again, sorry. Look, just to say, I think the overall one of the policy recommendations is for us to focus more on the social connections part of the picture, and certainly the work that we are doing internally is looking at that. I mean, I absolutely think we've got to measure, I think we need to do better on measurement overall of experience, and I think Australia is quite weak in being able to really look at how well it is supporting the settlement of people coming into the community. But I think a greater focus on data around social connection is really, really critical, and thinking about our programs as actually being something that is creating a sense of a bond between newcomers and people who are already here is really important part of our future direction. So thank you very much for that emphasis.
And Shabnam, your final thoughts in terms of just going off what Alison said about the biggest points of focus looking ahead about what our society, I suppose, can, in your opinion, work on the most?
Yep, I'd like to mention 2 points there. One, the fact that, whether it is through a gender lens, people are more engaging digitally on social media platforms, but not so much on, the core infrastructure of the society, like, opening their banking, for example, or their taxes. And that just goes to show that those services are not able to cater for them right now and their needs right now. They're just not making their services accessible, and that will have detrimental effects. People can be engaged socially but not be independent if they can't access some of those very basic services that will enable their independence or empowerment in the future. And another point that I want to make that hasn't been mentioned throughout the discussion but was noted in the report was the connection with the First Nations people. And I think that is a very, very important as settlement service providers or people who are at the first point of contact with new arrivals in the community. We are the information holders, and it does become a responsibility to foster those connections. There's a huge disconnect between refugee community and the First Nations community, and I think it's been very important for that information and that education to be provided from the very to be welcome from the very start in its holistic way.
Well, it's just past 2 o'clock, so might have to end it there. I'm sorry I've gone a little bit over. I've just really been enthralled with this conversation. I've personally found it extremely insightful, and I want to once again, on behalf of SSI and ACOS, thank you, Shanthi Robinson, Alison Larkins, Shabnam, Safa, and for all of you joining us today who've taken time out of your busy work and life schedules in COVID lockdown for many of you. I really appreciate it, and I hope that this has just added a bit more insight or understanding, or at least piqued your interest into certain points of conversation that you may not have thought about much before. Once again, thank you, and hopefully we can connect and discuss these issues again in the future. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.